Welcome back to The Doctors Are In, our podcast. I'm Reverend Dr. Katie Nix, with me Reverend Dr. Phil Blackwell. We are talking about the story of the merger of Legacy University and Legacy Grace. And today in our episode, we are talking with Joash, who was, or as I knew him, the lay leader of University United Methodist Church. But also, Joash, why don't you share kind of who you are in the real world, maybe is the way we want to say that. What do you do to pay the bills?
Sure. Yeah, I'm so glad I could be with you both today. I am a public relations professional. So if you hear of your traditional media relations, issues management, crisis communications, strategic communications, all of that, that's PR. That's what I do for a living. Based currently in the Chicago area, but as Pastor Katie, I was in St. Louis for a good 4 years, serving
Because you know
at
those Chicago
Legacy
people.
University, UMC. Yeah.
See our earlier seasons about the Cardinals-Cubs rivalry between the doctors here. So let's see, you talk about crisis management, strategic management. These are not things at all that had to come up during the merger, I'm sure. But I know you want to start out with the first question.
Joash, I'm an outsider to this whole event because I came here from Chicago about 4 years ago, so I missed everything that led up to it. And I wonder, when did the congregation at University Church begin to realize that it had to make some changes? And what were the range of possibilities that the members began to imagine?
So can you kind of start the story for us of how this all even began?
Sure. Yeah, and I guess that question will also take me to where how I started being involved at University UMC. When I moved down to St. Louis, I needed to find a United Methodist congregation that was dedicated to service, service to the community, service to God, service to each other, and finding a community that was Methodist to its core, right? And so I found University UMC and University City, and it was a wonderful congregation led by Reverend Diane. About, I guess, 2 or so years in, I guess I had made an impression on folks to the point where the nominations committee decided to nominate me to be the lay leader and council chair at University UMC. So I reluctantly accepted, but I accepted the job, and I started back in, I believe it was 2019. So it was right before the start of the pandemic. And I was expecting a opportunity where we can just continue on, right, a status quo, continue the great work being done at University UMC. But I think one of my first meetings, it was very clear that there was a desire to take some sort of action given the situation that the church was in. This is not an uncommon place where churches, especially a church like University UMC, where it's been there for decades and generations, to come to a turning point where it needs to make some decisions. And I know many churches right now have been facing similar issues of whether it's financial decline, membership decline, volunteer burnout, all of those issues that are coming to the forefront, which I think was accelerated during the pandemic. We were seeing that play out at university. And so the leadership team or the church council was very strategic and forward looking. With the help of Reverend Diane, I think they knew that something needed to be done to address it. And it took a courageous step to, number one, name the elephant in the room, that there was something going on that required change. And number two, to let the congregation know about it, and then eventually take steps to address it. And so after lots of conversations within the church, that ultimately led to a process which we called discerning our future. So through a discernment process, we began to think through the possibilities about how we were being led by the Holy Spirit to continue our mission as a church.
Let me pause, because I know what your question is, but I want to know, that alone, how in the world do you communicate that to a church without everybody freaking out? So, like, what, as someone who does this professionally, like, what's going, like, when you say talking with people, what does that communication plan look like even? I don't even know where to start that question, I would say.
Yeah, and of course, it's you really have to know the pulse on the ground to see how best to communicate. But I think the way we got to the point where we were doing the discernment process, so that between the recognition of there was a problem to starting the discernment process, that took at least a few months. I don't recall the exact timing, but perhaps even closer to more than a year or so. So I would say, from my professional background and expertise, there are three keys for a good communications foundation that you have to put down. So in any communications plan or strategy, there are elements that provide that foundation that churches, I think, should be aware of. And these three keys are something that I think applies to many efforts on the communications front. So the first key I would say is key audiences. So who are you talking to? With whom do you need to foster relationships? When we were looking at our discernment process, and even post discernment process, when we were exploring that merger with Legacy Grace, we segmented the congregation and other stakeholders into 5 or so groups. And the purpose of that was to really get into how each audience was thinking and feeling. So we divided them up to, let's see, the special attention members. These were folks who we knew needed attention, special attention, because, be it life events
The
going
grief
on,
work was going to
or
be huge, right? The extra grief work that they were going to need going through it. Yeah.
exactly, expressing reluctance over the whole process. We wanted to ensure that members who required special attention got the pastoral care, spiritual care, membership care that they needed. The second group was longer term members. These were members who have been at church for a while. Many of them have been there since they were young. They have a deep, special connection to the church, right? They've seen the highs and the lows. They've seen the changes throughout the years that they've been there. They've seen membership declines, multiple pastors. They themselves have served in leadership roles. They have links to former members. And some of them were homebound members who were expecting the church to be there in their aging and death. And so we also wanted to ensure that we were paying special attention to them. The third group, newer members or regular attendees. I myself was included in that group. Many of the newer members were young adults, youth. Some were in college, some were young professionals. Some of them were just discovering or rediscovering their faith. They were also in an interesting position in their faith journeys, right? And they also needed special attention and care. The other group and audience that we really identified was key was ministry constituents and community partners. So these are, either non-members, community members, folks that the church engages with outside of Sunday mornings, right? Folks who were impacted by the church's ministries. So this goes beyond just a food pantry. This included things like organizations that space share with the building, or parking lot co-owners, neighborhood associations, municipalities, other nearby churches. They don't have to be Methodist, right? And then the last group we identified was former clergy and staff. And I believe it was Pastor Diane who identified this group. Former clergy, former staff who've served the churches faithfully, people who've also entered the ministry through our churches. It was really important that we also made sure that they were aware of what was going on. And so these, 5 groups or so, or 5 or so groups, it might vary for each church, but you really have to figure out who you're talking to, put yourself in their shoes, understand their thoughts, their motivations, their feelings, in order to be responsive and attentive to their needs, because that's the way you're going to communicate effectively. The second key was key channels. So I don't know if you're familiar with Marshall McLuhan, who famously said, "The medium is the message." So this is true to an extent, I think, but it underscores a point: where you communicate really matters. So figure out where you're communicating. Each church is different, once again, but it's important to meet people where they are. Fortunately, at Legacy University, and I think Legacy Grace as well, and Current Grace, there was a really strong culture of ensuring that there are multiple communication channels where you can meet people where they're at. The third key messages. So what are you going to tell the people? If you are in the PR industry, or if you are just a cynical, engaged citizen, you might think of key messaging as some sort of PR spin, right? And that may be true for companies, that may be true for politicians, right? But I don't see it that way, especially how we approached it on the local church level. Crafting those key messages was crucial to help us organize our thoughts, articulate what we wanted to say, and ensure that everyone understood the most important things.
I
You might get
remember this part. Yeah, that it was like, okay, at this point in the merger, these are the things we want to make sure we are explaining, down to the point that I remember both churches were sending out the exact same email, and we were timing it as well, because we knew as soon as one person got it, they're calling somebody else to talk about it. So making sure that we were all talking about the same thing and hitting those same points at time really made a huge difference.
Now,
Yeah.
you ended up with a merger, which is working. What other possibilities did the congregation imagine as it moved through those couple of years of leading to what now is?
So you could pick the story back up now, is where we're at. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious, what were the options that the congregation saw?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. And we confronted various options. And again, credit to Pastor Diane, who really helped us narrow down those options and understand what each option meant. But we talked through just closure of the church, and seeing what that meant for the community and the mission of the church, and also how those funds, when you would close and sell the property, how those funds would be used, which is also a part of some of the other conversations and other options, right? So a pure closure was one option. A closure with a church restart was another option. I remember there were some discussions about what a vision for a multicultural, multiracial church could be, as a restart that came out of the closure of the Legacy University UMC. And then, of course, merger was that other option that we considered, that involved, again, the idea that we were going to close the church or sell the property, but not close the church as a pure, hey, let's just stop it all together, but finding out a way and figuring out a way to find a new way to continue our mission as a church.
And I remember when we were starting, when the decision was, well, let's begin to see what a merger could look like. One of the communication pieces that came out of it that I thought was really helpful is for it to be a true merger, to recognize that it is not one entity absorbing another entity, but that we were two coming together for the idea of creating something new. And so something as simple as we would started saying Legacy University and Legacy Grace to help understand that these were two separate stories, and while they kept the name Grace, it was a new process. So how, I want to say who was the genius behind, but I'm guessing it was you. But like, how did then, when you guys decide, okay, we're going to try this merger, how did you help communicate not only to university, but now you're also having to teach messages to Grace, keeping in mind that their pastor had not been there that long. We're all still not meeting in person. We're doing this all online. Like, there could have been a lot of tension at this point, as well as like turf wars, and none of that happened. And so how do you think we did that so well, being able to talk to each other, hear each other, create that common language moving forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the elements, again, was identifying those key audiences, ensuring that the way we're talking to the different stakeholders, different audiences, in a way that was responsive and attentive to their needs, and not just their needs, but their emotions, their feelings, right? And ensure that they feel cared for, right? I think that was really crucial to building trust so that when we were, for lack of a better term, negotiating between the two churches, that there was trust built, that we could have that opportunity to hash things out, what we needed to hash out, in a way that had a foundation, once again, of trust and clarity produced by those pieces of communication. And so, yeah, I think that's fundamental. The ensuring that you're meeting people where they're at, you're tailoring the way you talk to and communicate with people. And I should say this as well. It's about relationships. As pastors, you both know how crucial
Did you know that?
relationships are.
Maybe that's why I've been
I've
having.
forgotten it, yeah.
You forget.
Well, when the congregation decided that a merger was the best option, who came over to Grace and knocked on the door and said, hey, can we come in?
And more importantly, took a look at me and went, yeah, but it's still worth it. Let's come in anyway, right?
Well, I'm just saying, what's the process when it seems like your congregation was going through all of the hard work of discerning things,
Yeah.
and then you came here to Grace, I'm here,
Yeah.
and said,
Where we aren't having these conversations yet, and it's a very different story. And
yeah.
I remember how it happened, but it doesn't mean that might be the right way that it happened. What did you remember, Joash?
Well, Pastor Katie, correct me if I'm wrong, but even before we were determining the option to even consider, when we were at the start of the discernment process at Legacy University, we had sent letters to local churches and reached out to pastors. Again, Pastor Diane, to her credit, built those relationships with local pastors to say, hey, this is happening. We're doing this. We're discerning our future. It may or may not involve you. Let's talk through potential possibilities and opportunities.
Yes, that's how I remember it as well. And what I really appreciated through all of it is that Diane again was going, it was almost an asset-based discernment. Like, what are the relationships? What are these key points that have already tied us together to begin this? the conversation she and I started having one in the sense of confidentiality, but also in the sense she's like, we're going through something really big at university, and I need you to be praying. I need you to be checking in on me, because she knew this was going to be such a heavy load. So she started communicating with me about that early on. And then when we said, okay, now it's time to talk to leadership about this, university already had some clarity of, this is what we've gone through. This is what we're thinking, not this is going to happen, right? And it was very invitational. Like, could we just start talking about it? Like, it was very a disarming, beautiful thing. And because we had already been invited in to just be holding up our sister church, recognizing you guys were going through these hard things, like that foundation was laid, that as we started having these conversations, we capitalized on relationships that were already there. Absolutely.
So, given that there are not many books telling you how to do what you did,
0 from what we found out. Maybe like 1 or 2.
what did you learn from that was a good message you can give other people? And what did you learn from that is really never do this thing again kind of experience you had?
I think a key lesson is that communication will make or break a church merger. Communication creates...
It will make or break, and you could put a period at the end of that sentence, but yes.
Period, yes. Communication creates clarity. Clarity builds trust. And that trust eventually leads you to the courage you need to follow the movement of the Holy Spirit. So again, I was fortunate enough to have served with Reverend Diane and on a leadership team that understood the value of good communication. Because of my training, my work in PR and strategic communications, I was able to apply that knowledge in the way we approached the merger. But it takes the people who are willing to actually do the work, right? That's what's at the heart of it. Willing to do the work of communicating with others in a way that was all about fostering relationships, once again, to build that trust that leads to courage. And so if we were not willing to do that, if church members were not willing to do that, the discernment process that kicked this whole thing off in the first place for Legacy University, I don't think that would have been a successful process. I don't think the merger talks would not have been as successful as they were if not for the work that was being put in to ensure that people understood what was going on, number one, and number two, people were establishing and fostering those relationships to build that trust.
Well, I feel like that's the sermon right there. I mean, do you want to pass the offering plate and
I
do the
think so.
closing hymn?
Well, I don't think we're going to get much from the congregation here right now.
Joash, we are so thankful for, one, all of the time and effort and vision you put into this merger. I think, like you said, it was successful because university took the time and they did so much work. And in doing so, invited and gave grace a gift on... You showed us how to ask the questions that mattered, and you showed us how to have these talks in a way that were full of creativity and opportunity, and that is a gift that is now, I think, just blossoming here because of all that hard work. So thank you for all of that. We appreciate you so much coming on the podcast, and we look forward to seeing everyone come back for our next episode as we continue on this journey together.
Thank you.